Welcome, everybody. Welcome to yet another episode of Contemplate over your life. Today I want to talk about 11 lessons applicable to life that I've learned from stories, that I've learned from religions, from philosophy and science. And I would qualify those as wisdom. Alright, first, what is really the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Well, knowledge, you can learn all sorts of stuff from books, from documentaries, and that usually consists of language that you can think about. But that's not quite yet wisdom, is it? Wisdom is something when you have experienced it, when you've lived it, when you've felt it in your body, and when it's guided your actions, and something that you've really learned from life itself. So let's look at 11 lessons that I've learned. The first one being, you should have an aim. And I think the beautiful thing about this picture here is that the little guy, he tries to hit the target, but the target just keeps on moving. And well, that might get pretty damn frustrating, obviously, but he still keeps doing it. And the reason why I think this image is so good at telling us a story is that we know from psychology that happiness basically depends on having positive emotions. And having positive emotions really correlates to having an aim in life, having a purpose, something that you strive for, that gets you out of bed in the morning, that makes you think that today you've worked towards that purpose. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not necessarily reaching the purpose, fulfilling it, it's more working towards it. So even though the target itself just keeps on moving and you might never hit it, it's good to have a target to aim at. And having aim in life is really one of the most important things. As we've seen in the previous video, there's really no such thing as neutral observation. It's not that we passively get the world, coming to us. No, what we see in the world, what we hear in the world, what we acknowledge in the world, is basically determined by a value system. And that value system is, of course, hierarchical. So it should have, an aim at the top. And it doesn't really matter what that aim is. Well, you can have an aim for yourself. In the previous video, we've looked at what people might consider to be desirable in life. Obviously, terms like happiness or money. People seem to want money, even though we know that it doesn't really accrue to more happiness in the end. But let's talk about success. Okay, you want to be successful. That's a good aim. So it gives you something to get out of bed for, improve yourself, improve your talent, work towards it. And you find that, even if you have a pretty lousy day, you don't do much, but you've worked at your thing, whatever that may be, then at least you'll have done something. And it gives meaning to your life incredibly. So you should really have an aim. Well, let's look at this next slide here. Let's look what happens. Well, I really can't get enough of the bit. The animal is probably okay, so he just gets up on his feet and tries again. I really don't know what kind of animal it is, maybe like a ferret or something. But the nice thing about this is, when he goes for it, when he stands here, you really think, all right, he'll make it, He's bouncing and he's got the strength in his legs. He'll make it, you might probably think the first time. But he doesn't really reach it by a far stretch, does he? The distance is just way too big. But you gotta do it. You have to jump into the deep. You have to throw yourself into the deep. Let's say, well, we are, of course, conservative creatures. And we like to stay within our comfort zone. In psychological terms, basically the world is divided into what we know and what we don't know. And we want to stay inside the circle of what we know. But of course, then you don't grow. And then you don't have adventures, you don't get to go into the world and see all that it has to offer if you just stay inside your own comfort zone. So sometimes life or your friends or someone just kicks you out of your own comfort zone, and that's good because you really have to jump into it, and you might be a bit fearful about that, a bit stressful about that. You come into new surroundings and you don't know, let's say like a new job. This new job, it has its own lingo. People talk in ways that you don't quite understand yet, and all the terms that you still have to learn. You just gotta do it. Gotta jump into the deep. Alright? Wisdom is more than reason. Well, speaking for myself personally, I've always associated wisdom with reason a little bit too much. And that has basically to do, I guess, with the fact that I was brought up as a philosopher, here in the West. And here in the West, ever since Plato, since Descartes, we've really tangled those two together in the sense that what is wise is what, could be reasonably explained in language. And later on, when I came into contact with, let's say, Eastern philosophies, and I discovered that there's just so much more than language. Our perception of the world, as we've seen in the previous video, is non-linear. It's happening all over the place, while language is linear and symbolical. So there's just so much more to it than language, than reason. Because reason, of course, is what we usually associate with linguistical thought. So, just to conclude within yourself that there's just so much to you that you cannot reasonably explain or explain away, because that's usually how it is used. Wisdom is more than reason. Don't do anything that makes you weak. Well, I think that we are usually inclined to take the path of least resistance. Let's say you have an excuse for having not done something, and an excuse is usually a lie. You should have emailed this or that person, and you should have paid that bill, and you say, the check is in the mail, when it obviously is not in the mail. It makes you weak. If you tell a lie, you build up a wall, really between you and the other person, in a more broader sense, between you and the world entirely. Because you have to remember what lie you told to who, and you just can't be yourself anymore, and that diminishes your strength. And I've noticed this with my students as well. Last week I had a student, I gave up some homework, and I say, okay, read this paragraph, 2.1. And when I checked to see if they've read it, one of them says that I couldn't read it because I didn't know what page it was on. Which is obviously a really, really lousy excuse, because you can look just in the book and see what page it is on. So if you encounter a little bit of resistance and you just give up, that's making you weak. And I've noticed that with a lot of people who think that they can't do anything. Think of your maybe you have a grandfather or a father that's old, or a mother, and they're not really of the digital age, and you have to help them with a computer, let's say. Sometimes when you have to do something on a computer, all you have to really do is just look at the screen, be a little bit patient, see what's on the screen, and then you can pursue an action. And some people just give up. I don't know how to do it. Just throw it aside, and that's also making you quite weak. So don't do that. Well, make music, and just look at how this guy is really getting into it, isn't he? And for music, you can obviously substitute anything that you have a passion for, anything that aligns with your talents, and that really makes you feel present in the moment. So be it theater or sport or painting or whatever. If you have a passion like that, and you grow within that passion, you develop your talents within that, which obviously also aligns with my first lesson here. So you should have an aim. Developing your talent is a very valuable and I think noble aim. So that also goes with this saying of you have to make music. Well, for me it is music, and I think the nice thing about music is there's many nice things about music. I really like to quote Nietzsche here, who says, "Ohne Musik wäre mir das Leben ein Irrtum." Without music, life would be a mistake. And I really love that one. Nietzsche was a brilliant musician, by the way. He composed quite a lot of works for piano, He was quite a good piano player. Anyway, back to music. When you make music, you find it is really a power workout for your brain. You know, deep down, music is, on its most abstract level, is just tonal intervals, which could be considered as pure math. So at this one point, at some level, you're making all these mathematical calculations almost, let's say, while at the same time you use your psychomotoric system and your emotional system, obviously, because music is pure emotion as well. So when you do that, you find time, that you find that time rolls out a little bit differently. You're more in the moment, you're in the present. And at that point, you're being optimally fulfilled, let's say. Because you're working with your talents, you're really in the moment in a way that you're usually not. We're so easily distracted by thought, obviously, and by other things going on. And if we are really submerged in our art, our passion, and we feel even the nature of time being quite different than we would have assumed. Okay, let's just look at this little guy here with the chair, see what he's doing. He's scared, he's getting it back. And so it goes on and on, because we know what this guy's going to do. Obviously, yes, he's going to steal back the chair. So you have to know what you're responsible for. Well, these two guys here, we don't really know who started it. In the first slide, we kind of thought, he's the thief here. But then the other guy just goes back to the other house and steals it. So they're just keeping themselves into this eternal, perpetual cycle, let's say. So they're both responsible for it. Well, you obviously know that you're responsible for yourself, what you say, what you do. You might not always know what the consequences of those actions are. But, you could ask yourself the question, are you responsible for those consequences yourself? Well, let's consider man as a consumer for a second. What kind of clothes you wear. If you buy clothes that are made, in sweatshops in Eastern Asia, then as a part, you're responsible for that kind of system, being rewarded with the money that you pay for it. So you're keeping the system intact, you're contributing to it. And the same thing with what you eat. Most people, when you ask them about what they eat, do you eat meat or not? And people who eat meat, they usually say, well, but I don't really support, factory farming, because that's horrible for the animals. But then if you just go buy a hamburger at McDonald's, of course, that you're contributing to factory farming. So you're also responsible for that, even though at that point you don't really feel responsible for it, because to you it's just a delicious burger. So you have to know what you're responsible for, and you're responsible for a lot of more things than you might initially have thought. Okay, follow your example and be an example. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, taught us a lot about virtue, where his teacher, Plato, he thought that virtues were, let's say, more abstract. You have the virtue of courage and justice, sort of abstract ideals that you can work towards. For Aristotle, virtue was a really concrete presence in people. If we look at our leading examples, our heroes. And that's how we learn them, we learn basically through stories. In a previous video, I've explained how the self has a narrative structure, and our culture has a narrative structure as well, meaning that it revolves about the stories we tell ourselves and we tell each other, and that are being told to us. And stories are really just distilled reality, aren't they? What we find interesting about reality, if you want to write a story about some hero, and you don't write about how he does the dishes, or what kind of sandwich he is eating, if it's not relevant to the story, so you just throw it out. And what we keep, obviously, is the essence of what it means to be human. So in stories and in our examples, we find really something great to adhere to in our own lives. For instance, Jesus, who is the prime example of Western culture. The way he He took on suffering, and that's an example of how to live your life. And of course, you've got your own heroes. Well, maybe you want to be, let's say, the next Lionel Messi, you know, one of the best soccer players ever. And following that example could be really interesting. You know, go to the bookstore, read a biography, see what makes someone great, and read about the struggles. And for me, and personally, my heroes, I love to read biographies, and to see that your heroes have gone through all these struggles. Because, as we've seen in the previous video, what we see about people is the outer layer of success, like in the iceberg. What's below that is, of course, the rejection and the struggle and all that. And if you read about it, you can really be inspired. Inspired to deal with your own struggles and with your own pains in life, let's say. So follow your example and be an example. You'll find that if you progress in life and you develop a virtue, and people may look up to you. Maybe your little brother or sister looks up to you. And that's also a bit of responsibility as well. You know, one of the things that you're responsible for, as we've seen in the previous slide. So learn to be an example as well. Well, this little guy right here is quite famous from a really nice and funny internet video called the Marshmallow Test. I really advise you to look it up. So in the Marshmallow Test, we have a small child about 4 years old, and we put him in a room with a nice, fat, juicy marshmallow right in front of him. And we give him the rule that if he doesn't eat it for 10 minutes, if he lets it long, he gets a second marshmallow. And the reason why this is so hard for kids, because of course kids love sweet stuff, as we all do, let's be honest. You know, there's a good evolutionary reason for that, obviously, because for the longest time in our history, when we were hunter-gatherers and before that with our ancestors, it's been a really good rule to eat all the sugars that you can get your hands on when you go around in the forest, and there's not so much of it around. But if you try to follow that rule in present days, when you go to the supermarket and get as much sugar as you can get your hands on, you'll die. You'll die quite soon, because everything contains sugar, much more sugar than is good for us. So, anyway, we like sugar, as kids do, and what this little guy here doesn't know is that in his little brain, there's a big war going on between at one side, let's say, his amygdala that is really programmed to get it. You know, if there's a source of fat and sugar right in front of you, you should get it now. Even though there's another part of the brain that's more concerned with, let's say, future reasoning. So the part of the brain that says, okay, just wait 10 minutes, and 10 minutes is obviously quite a long time for this little kid. And quite abstract as well. In 10 minutes he'll get a second marshmallow. So there's really a struggle within him going on. But we know from studies that the kids who were able to restrain themselves, to just let the marshmallow sit there for 10 minutes, they'll eventually be a lot more successful in life. And that really that brings focus on the essence of success here, doesn't it? Success seems to be that you're able to just let that marshmallow stand there for 10 minutes. It's actually the delaying of instant gratification. You know, there's a part of us that just wants to get it now, but we know that we'll reap rewards in the future. And that's basically what success is. You know, we sacrifice the present in order to get greater rewards in the future. So you have to bring the right sacrifice, symbolized here by this marshmallow. Well, let's look at this guy here. He's quite famous on the internet. This is Ted Haggard, and he's quite well known from this beautiful documentary called Jesus Camp. And in this documentary we see the American evangelicals and one of their mega churches where he is one of the leading figures. And this guy here, Ted Haggard, he had made a career within the church, basically with 3 big pillars of thought. You know, homosexuality is wrong, and drugs is wrong, and prostitution is wrong. Well, okay. Not long after they've shot this documentary, it turned out that this guy here himself had sex with a guy that he paid in drugs. So he was immediately guilty of all those three things that he spent a career on talking down at. So what's going on here mentally with him? And this point in the documentary really says it beautifully, because he looks into the camera and he says, "I know what you did last night. And if you give me $1,000, I won't tell your wife." We know that this actually happened. The male prostitute was blackmailing him to tell his wife, and he wanted $1,000. So this is basically what Freud says about the subconscious. We really want to live in harmony with the world, and if there's some part of us that cannot be in this particular world that we've constructed, so let's say a Christian worldview where homosexuality is bad, we try to push it down into our unconscious, and it always gets out. And we really want to be caught. That's one of the main points in Freudian reason here. That's why he has to look into the camera and sort of confessing his own sins in a symbolical way by addressing the viewer. So what does this guy really believe about, let's say, homosexuality or drugs? Well, if we ask people, what do you believe? We always get the good answer, don't we? Well, I believe that we should take care of one another and we should do this and that. It's always sounding quite nice. But are people really acting according to that? Usually they are not. An existentialist would say, you can learn about people by looking at what they're doing, not by what they're saying, because we're just words all the time, just talking. So this guy here, this is cognitive dissonance of quite a high order, I would say. And don't be like that, because you'll get split in two or more parts, and you'll be excluded from the world in which you try to live harmoniously. Right, observe. This is a skill that contains some time, I would say, to develop as well. Usually when we talk about observing, let's talk about having a conversation with someone. I find that a lot of people seem to have this attitude in conversations where they just wait till the other guy has stopped talking, and then they can say their own thing, and then it just goes on and on like that. But they're not really listening. And there's such a strength to be gained if you learn how to develop that skill, to see and to listen. For instance, I've been a bartender for a while, and I found that really fascinating, because you can learn so much about people. The philosopher Sartre as well, he's written most of his works sitting in a bar and observing people. And the funny thing is, if you're a bartender, people go sit at the bar and they drink and have all these talks, and they sort of seem to forget that there's someone, just a couple of inches away from them. So they talk as if they're completely private, and then you can learn so much and see, let's say if you work in a bar, you see a guy and a girl go out on their first date, and you just watch and observe it, and it shows really the whole of human nature. So learn to observe. And then finally, the 11th one, don't take yourself too seriously, which is beautifully depicted by Winnie the Pooh over here. So if we think about people who really, really take themselves too serious, those are not the fun people, are they? People that we want to be around. What we usually love in people is a sense of humor, and also a sense of humor at their own expense. Look at yourself. You're full of thoughts and thrives that you don't really fully understand, and sometimes you do things that might amaze yourself. And maybe there's some virtue in it to be able to laugh at it, to be amazed at your own folly sometimes, let's say. And I find that when there's humor, there's not so much of dogma or ideology. And that's one reason why most religions, they're not really into humor, aren't they? They really can't take a joke. Even though that's something that we appreciate a lot in people that we select as friends. Because we want to laugh, we want to have a good time. And if people take themselves too damn seriously all the time, there's really nothing to laugh at, is there? Alright, so these were my 11 lessons for life. Thank you all for watching this episode of Contemplate or Your Life. and I'll see you in the next episode.